The family deck of the GCS Harmony's cradle was the loudest place on the entire colony ship, and nobody seemed to mind at all. It was a wide-open space that stretched across an entire level of the vessel, filled with low tables and soft flooring and bright panels of light that shifted color depending on which species was sitting beneath them. Warm gold for the Tohari, cool blue for the Valesi, pale green for the Drotha hatchlings who liked to pile on top of each other in the play corners. Children of every shape and size filled the room with noise and movement, and the kind of beautiful chaos that only the very young could create without any effort at all. In the middle of it all, sitting at a low table near the dining area, a small Tohari cub named Nilha was trying very hard to tell a story. She was 4 years old and covered in soft silver fur, with darker spots along her ears and the bridge of her nose, and she had the kind of energy that made adults tired, just from watching her breathe. Across the table sat a Drotha hatchling named Kovin, a small green-scaled creature with enormous curious eyes, who was doing his very best to follow the cub's rapid and confusing tale about a dream she had the night before. And then the big fish was flying, Nyla said, waving both paws in the air. But it was not a real fish, because it had legs, and also it was purple, and it was chasing me, but I was not scared, because I had a stick. Kovin blinked slowly and said nothing, because he had learned from experience that Nyla did not actually need anyone to respond during her stories. She just needed someone to sit there and look impressed. Nyla reached for her cup of water without looking at it, because she was too busy making the fish fly with her paws, and her left paw clipped the edge of the cup and sent it tumbling sideways across the table. 8 ounces of clean cold water rushed across the flat surface and dripped off the bottom edge onto the smooth composite floor below. Nilha stopped talking and looked down at the puddle, and then at the cup, and then at Kovin, who blinked again. "Oops," she said. It was a small moment, the kind of thing that happened 100 times a day on the family deck, the kind of accident that every child in the galaxy had caused, at one point or another, since the beginning of time itself. Nilha slid off her seat, and her small paws touched the floor, and she turned toward the towel dispenser on the far wall, ready to walk over and grab something to clean up her mess, because that was what Tohari cubs were taught to do. Handle it yourself. Fix your own problems. Be strong. Her mother, Reshra, watched from a bench about 20 steps away, where she had been reading a cultural report on her datapad, and she glanced at the spill, and then back at her reading without concern, because this was not even close to something worth worrying about. Water. On a table. In a room designed for children, but somewhere on the ship, in a monitoring station 3 decks above the family area, a small light blinked on a screen. A microsensor, embedded in the surface of the dining table, had detected liquid displacement in proximity to a registered miner, and it sent a quiet signal through the ship's internal safety network. And that signal landed on the wristcom of Sergeant Mara Okafor, team leader of the Human Emergency Response Unit assigned to the family deck rotation. Okafor was sitting in the monitoring room with her boots up on the console and a cold cup of coffee in her hand, and she saw the alert appear on her display. A small yellow tag that read, Level 1, Child Safety, Slip Hazard, Sector 7, Dining. She put her coffee down. She did not hesitate, and she did not think about whether this was worth her time, because in her mind, there was no version of reality where a child near a wet floor was not worth her time. She tapped her comm and said, Dev, Kowalski, Lynn, Level 1 on the family deck, Sector 7 Dining, liquid spill near a miner, go, now. Corporal Devlin Reyes was already moving before the sentence was finished, because he had heard the alert on his own comm half a second earlier, and had already picked up his kit bag from beside his chair in the break room. He walked fast, but did not run, because running scared children, and Dev never scared children if he could help it. He crossed the family deck in 11 seconds, his eyes already locked on the small silver-furred cub who was walking toward the towel dispenser on the far wall. Nyla had taken exactly 2 steps. Dev was already there. He dropped to one knee beside the table with a warm, easy smile on his face and a clean towel already pulled from his kit, and he looked at Nyla with the kind of calm, gentle focus that made children feel like the most important person in the house. "Hey there, little one," he said in accented but passable Tohari. "Looks like your cub had an adventure. You okay?" Nyla looked up at the tall human with wide, golden eyes, and then looked at the towel, and then back at his face and said, "I was going to get a towel." "I know you were," Dev said, still smiling, "but I was closer." Behind him, Kowalski and Lin entered the sector from 2 different directions, one carrying a replacement cup of water, and the other already scanning the floor around the table with a small handheld device. Reshra looked up from her datapad. She stared at the 3 humans who had materialized around her daughter's spilled water, like soldiers responding to a hull breach, and her ears flattened slowly against her head in the Tohari expression of pure bewilderment. She set the datapad down on her lap. She watched Kowalski place a fresh cup of water in front of Nyla with a gentle smile, and she watched Lin set down a small, yellow, wet floor marker beside the table, and she watched Dev wipe the table clean with the kind of focus and care that her people usually reserved for sacred rituals. 3 adults, 3 trained emergency responders, for a cup of water knocked over by a 4-year-old. Reshra blinked once, and then twice, and then she said, very quietly to herself in Tohari, "It is just water." But the humans were not finished, and they did not look like they planned to be finished anytime soon. And somewhere above them, in the observation gallery, a tall insectoid figure named Tikrath was watching everything, with his datapad already open and his stylus already moving. He had seen many strange things aboard this ship, but he had never seen anything quite like this. Dev did not just wipe the table. He cleaned the table, and then he pulled a small spray bottle from his kit and sanitized the entire surface with a solution that was safe for Tohari skin and Drotha scales, and every other biological surface that might touch it. And he wiped it again with a second clean towel until the surface was completely dry. Then he crouched beside the table and aimed a small handheld scanner at the floor beneath it, moving the device slowly back and forth across the composite tiles, until the screen gave him a green reading that confirmed 0 residual moisture on the walking surface. He placed a temporary wet floor marker next to the table anyway, because the protocol said to leave it for 15 minutes, even after a clean scan. Then he entered a note into his wristcom, flagging the table for a maintenance follow-up later that cycle, just in case the drainage microchannels beneath the surface had been affected by the spill. Took him about 4 minutes. Nyla sat in her chair the entire time, drinking from her brand-new cup of water that Kowalski had brought her, watching the tall human with the kind of fascination that only a 4-year-old could maintain for that long without getting bored. "What is that?" she asked, pointing at the scanner. "This tells me if the floor is wet," Dev said. "Why?" "Because if the floor is wet, you might slip and fall." "I would not fall," Nyla said, with the absolute unshakable confidence of a child who had never once considered the possibility that she was not invincible. Dev smiled at her and said, "I know you would not, but I like to check anyway." On the other side of the dining area, Kowalski had not sat down either, because she had started walking along the row of tables, checking the placement of every cup and container within reach of a child-sized arm. And she found 2 cups sitting dangerously close to the edges of their tables, and she gently moved them both toward the center, without saying a word to the parents nearby. Lin had finished her perimeter scan of the sector, and was now standing at the entrance, with her arms folded, looking calm and relaxed to anyone passing by. But her eyes were moving slowly across the room, the way a person's eyes move when they are counting heads, and checking exits, and measuring distances between small bodies and hard surfaces. Reshra stood up from her bench and walked toward Dev, with her ears still flat and her tail held low in the Tohari posture that meant she was not angry, but she was very much trying to understand something that did not make sense to her. "Corporal," she said, and her voice was polite but firm, "my daughter knocked over a cup of water." "Yes, ma'am," Dev said, standing up and tucking the scanner back into his kit. "She is not hurt." "No, ma'am, she is not. The water was not hot, and it was not a chemical, and it was not anything dangerous at all." "That is correct, ma'am." Reshra looked at the wet floor marker, and then at the fresh cup, and then at Kowalski, who was still adjusting cups on the far side of the room, and then back at Dev. "Then why are there 3 of you?" she said. Dev opened his mouth, but before he could answer, his comm chirped, and the voice of Sergeant Okafor came through, clear and calm and completely serious. "Liaison Reshra," Okafor said, because she had been listening and watching the entire time from the monitoring station. "I understand this may seem like an excessive response, and I respect that your culture encourages independence in young cubs, but I want to explain our reasoning, if you will allow me a moment." Reshra looked at the comm on Dev's wrist as if it had personally offended her, and then she said, "Go ahead." "Your daughter is 4 years old," Okafor said, "and the floor of the dining sector is hard composite material, rated for heavy foot traffic, and when that surface is wet, its friction coefficient drops by approximately 18%. And at your daughter's height and mass, a slip loss of balance event on that surface could result in a minor contusion or, in a worse case, a fractured growth plate in her foreleg. And I have reviewed Tohari pediatric data, and I know that growth plate injuries in cubs under 5 can affect limb development if not treated within the first hour." Reshra said nothing. Okafor said, "We would rather mop a floor than file a medical report." The comm went quiet, and the dining area seemed very still for a moment, even though children were still playing and laughing all around them, and Reshra stared at nothing in particular, while her mind tried to process the fact that a human she had never spoken to before had apparently memorized her species' pediatric injury data. Nilha tugged on Dev's pant leg and said, "Do you know any tricks?" Dev looked down at her and smiled, then reached into his kit bag and pulled out a small coin and held it in front of her and made it disappear between his fingers. And Nilha gasped so hard she nearly fell off her chair. "Again," she said. "Okay, but you have to hold your cup with both paws this time," Dev said. And Nilha grabbed her cup with both paws and held it tight against her chest, like it was the most precious thing she had ever owned. Reshra watched her daughter laugh at a human magic trick, and she felt something shift inside her chest that she did not have a word for yet. High above the family deck, in the observation gallery that ringed the upper level, Liaison Tikrath stood, with his long segmented fingers wrapped around his datapad, and his compound eyes focused on the scene below. He had been assigned to study human behavioral patterns aboard the Harmony's Cradle for the Galactic Cooperative's Cultural Integration Program, and he had been doing this work for nearly 11 months, and in that time he had filled over 600 pages of notes. But this moment, this small, ordinary moment of a cub and a cup of water and 3 humans who had moved like the fate of the galaxy depended on a dry floor, this was the moment he felt he was finally beginning to understand something important. He opened a new section in his report and typed the header slowly and carefully. Human Threat Response, Category Preemptive Compassion. He paused and looked down at the family deck one more time, where Dev was making the coin appear behind Nilha's ear, and the cub was squealing with delight, and Reshra was standing, with her arms crossed, and her ears slowly rising back to their normal position, which meant she was no longer confused. She was thinking. Tikrath began to write. The humans responded to a non-emergency involving a Tohari cub, with a team of 3, specialized equipment, and an estimated 6.5 minutes of coordinated labor. He typed. The cub was not injured, and the cub was never in danger, and the humans did not care about this distinction, because to them there was no distinction. A child was near a hazard, and that was all they needed to know. He saved the file, and closed the datapad, and stood there for a long time, watching the humans watch the children, and he realized that they never stopped. Not for one single second did they ever stop watching the children. And he wondered if anyone else on this ship had noticed that yet. Tikrath called the meeting for the following morning in Conference Chamber 9, a mid-sized room on the administrative deck with a long curved table and seats designed to fit at least a dozen different body types. He titled the meeting Discussion of Human Behavioral Trends Aboard the GCS Harmony's Cradle, and he sent the invitation to representatives from 8 species, and he expected maybe half of them to show up, because interspecies behavioral studies were not exactly the most exciting topic on a colony ship. Every single one of them came. They came early. Some of them brought notes. Tikrath stood at the front of the room with his datapad and looked out at the faces and eyes and sensory organs of the gathered delegates. And he realized that he was not the only one who had been watching the humans. He was just the only one who had been writing it down. "Thank you all for coming," he said in the flat, precise tone of a Valesi administrator. "Have called this meeting of the Interspecies Behavioral Committee to discuss a pattern I have observed among the human crew members assigned to family and child safety roles aboard this vessel. And I believe many of you have observed the same pattern." A low murmur passed through the room. Tikrath continued, "Yesterday afternoon, a Tohari cub spilled a cup of water on the family deck, and within 11 seconds, 3 human emergency responders arrived at her location, with cleaning supplies, scanning equipment, a replacement beverage, and what I can only describe as the emotional intensity of a battlefield medical team. The Dratha representative, a broad, heavy-scaled engineer named Vrask, let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "I know that sound," Tikrath said, "and I suspect you have a story of your own." Vrask leaned forward, rested his thick forearms on the table, and looked at the room with the tired expression of someone who had been carrying a secret for too long. "My hatchling," he said slowly, "has a mobility chair because his rear legs did not develop properly in the egg. And he gets around fine. He has always gotten around fine. But there is a small lip between Habitat Zone 4 and the central corridor, maybe 2 inches tall. And the chair bumps over it every time, and it is not dangerous, and it is not a problem, and my son does not care about it at all." He paused. 3 weeks ago I came home from a shift, and the lip was gone. And in its place there was a smooth, custom-built ramp with a gentle slope and grip texture designed specifically for Dratha mobility equipment. And I asked the maintenance crew who had ordered it, and they said no one ordered it. And I asked who built it, and they said a human from the emergency response team had come down during the night cycle with fabrication tools and installed it himself and left before anyone woke up. The room was quiet. Later it was Corporal Reyes, Frosk said, and when I went to thank him, he seemed confused about why I was thanking him. As if the idea of a child struggling with a 2-inch lip was something so obviously unacceptable that fixing it did not require thanks or permission or even a work order. Tikrath nodded and looked at the next delegate, a tall Valesi female named Pritha, who served on the education committee. Pritha's voice was soft and precise as she spoke. "I have a larva in the shipboard nursery," she said, "and Valesi larvae are sensitive to light spectrum, which most species do not know because we do not discuss it openly. But it is documented in the cooperative's biological database if someone were to look for it." She paused. A human volunteer in the nursery looked for it, and she found the entry that described the optimal spectral frequency for Valesi larval comfort. And the next day, I brought my child to the nursery. Rest area had been changed, not in the whole room, but just in his corner, just in the exact space where he slept, adjusted to the precise frequency that calms Valesi young. She tilted her head in the way Valesi did, when they were trying to express something they did not fully understand. "I did not ask for this," she said. "I did not know it was possible to adjust the lighting in individual sections of the nursery. And when I asked the volunteer how she knew to do it, she said she had spent her evening reading the biological profiles of every child in her care, because she wanted to make sure she was not missing anything." Tikrath recorded every word. A Catholian delegate spoke next, a broad amphibious being named Selketh, who represented the aquatic habitats. "The humans installed additional emergency drainage sensors in our youth swimming pools," Selketh said. And his voice rumbled through a translator that turned his deep underwater speech into common galactic standard. The pools already met every safety regulation in the cooperative code, and the sensors were not required, and we did not ask for them. He shifted in his specially designed water-filled seat. When I asked the human engineer why she installed them, she said that the existing sensor margin of error was within acceptable limits, but she could not stop thinking about what would happen if those limits were ever reached with a child in the water. And she said she had not been able to sleep for 2 nights because of this thought. And so she built new sensors with a narrower margin and installed them herself. Selketh looked around the room. "She could not sleep," he repeated, "because of a mathematical possibility that a child who was not hers, and was not even her species, might be in a pool when a sensor failed." The room sat with that for a moment. Then a voice came from the back, low and rough and old. It was an elderly Tohari male named Gavin, a retired cultural historian who had been aboard the Harmony's cradle since its launch. And he did not stand up because his joints were stiff with age, but he spoke clearly, and everyone turned to listen. "My grandcub was in the medical ward 4 months ago," he said. "She had a respiratory infection that is common in young Tohari, and it was not serious, but it was painful, and she was scared, and she could not sleep because the ward was unfamiliar, and the sounds were wrong, and the air smelled like medicine instead of home." He paused, and his old golden eyes were wet. "A human nurse sat with her through the entire night cycle," he said. "She did not have to, because it was not her shift and she was not assigned to my grandcub's care. But she came in and sat beside the bed, and she sang, very softly, and I did not understand the words, because they were in a human language I do not speak." His voice cracked slightly, but at some point during the night, the nurse took my grandcub's paw and placed it against her own chest, right over her heart, and she held it there, and my grandcub fell asleep, listening to the heartbeat of a creature from another world. Nobody spoke. "I found out later," Gavin said, "that the nurse had read in a Tohari cultural file that our cubs heal better when they feel a heartbeat nearby, because it reminds them of sleeping beside their mothers when they are very small. And this human woman who had no connection to my family and no obligation to my grandcub had gone and found that information and used it to comfort a child who was not hers." Tikrath set down his stylus because his hands were not steady enough to write. The room remained silent for a long time, and it was the kind of silence that happens when a group of very different beings all arrive at the same feeling at the same time, even though none of them have the words for it yet. Tikrath finally spoke. "Returning to," he said, "the question that I believe brings all of us to this table today is a simple one. Why do they do this?" He looked around the room. "These are not their young," he said. "These are not their species. These children share no blood, and no bond, and no genetic investment with the humans who protect them. And yet the humans behave as though every child on this ship is their own." No one answered. Reshra, who had been sitting in the back of the room at Tikrath's invitation, stood up slowly, and her ears were forward, and her expression was something no one in the room could quite read. "I think I need to ask them," she said quietly. And then she turned and walked out of the room, toward the human section of the ship, and the silence she left behind was heavier than any words could have been. The human crew quarters were on Deck 14, a section of the ship that smelled like coffee and recycled air, and something warm, that Reshra could not identify, but that reminded her somehow of bread. She walked through the corridor, with her ears turning at every sound, because she had never actually visited the human habitat section before, and everything about it felt different from the rest of the ship, in ways she had not expected. The walls were not bare. Every corridor she passed had something on it: a printed photograph, a hand-drawn picture, a pinned note, a small shelf with a plant growing under an artificial light. And Reshra realized that the humans had decorated their living space the way a family decorates a home, not the way a crew maintains a vessel. She found the lounge at the end of the main corridor, and she stopped in the doorway, because the room took her breath in a way she was not prepared for. The walls were covered in drawings, paintings, and cards from children. Not human children. Every species. There were crayon pictures from Tohari cubs, with stick-figure humans holding big round heads and wide smiles, and claw paintings from Dratha hatchlings in bright reds and greens, and delicate ink impressions from Valesi larvae that looked like abstract patterns, but probably meant something beautiful in their own language. There were thank you notes pinned to a board in at least 12 different scripts, and there were small gifts lined up on a shelf: a Catholian waterstone, a Tohari woven bracelet, a Dratha scale bead on a string, and every single item had been placed with care, as though it mattered more than anything else in the room. Sergeant Mara Okafor sat in a low chair beneath all of this, her boots off and her feet tucked under her, and a datapad in her hands, and she looked up when Reshra appeared in the doorway, and she did not seem surprised. "Liaison Reshra," she said. Her voice was the same voice from the calm and steady and serious, but with something underneath it that sounded like kindness. "Sergeant," Reshra said, and she stepped inside and sat in the chair across from Okafor, and she did not waste time with small talk, because Tohari did not do small talk, and she suspected Okafor would respect that. "Why did you send 3 people to clean up my daughter's water?" Reshra said. Okafor looked at her for a moment, and then she set the datapad down on the arm of the chair, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she was quiet for long enough that Reshra began to wonder if she had offended her. But Okafor was not offended. She was deciding where to begin. "Do you know much about Earth?" Okafor asked. "I know it is a mid-range terrestrial world in a yellow star system," Reshra said. "I know your species evolved there, and I know you joined the cooperative relatively recently." "Mid-range," Okafor repeated. She smiled in a way that was not quite happy. "That is what the cooperative database calls it. Mid-range. But the beings who wrote that entry never lived there." She leaned back in her chair. "Earth is a death world, Reshra, and I do not say that to be dramatic, because I am not a dramatic person. But I need you to understand what that means if you want to understand why 3 of my people showed up for a cup of water." Reshra said nothing and waited. "Our planet is covered in predators," Okafor said. "Not small ones, not weak ones, predators with teeth and claws and venom and speed. And our ancestors did not have any of those things, because humans are soft and slow and fragile, compared to almost everything else that lived alongside us." She held up her hand and flexed her fingers. "These hands cannot tear through anything stronger than paper," she said, "and our skin breaks if you press a sharp edge against it, and our bones snap under pressure that a Tohari cub can survive without flinching, and we cannot see in the dark, and we cannot hear the way you can, and we cannot smell danger the way a Dratha can." She lowered her hand. "But the worst part is our children." Reshra's ears tilted forward. "Human children are born completely helpless," Okafor said, "and I mean completely. They cannot walk, and they cannot feed themselves, and they cannot hold up their own heads, and they cannot do anything at all except cry and breathe and depend entirely on someone else to keep them alive." She paused. "For years, Reshra, not days or weeks but years, a human child cannot survive without constant care. and even after they can walk and talk and feed themselves, they are still fragile, and still small, and still vulnerable to every single danger on a world that was already trying to kill them before they were born. Okafor's voice did not waver, but her eyes had changed, deepened in a way that Reshra recognized as the look of someone speaking from a place very far inside themselves. "Our history is written in the graves of children," Okafor said. "Every generation of humans that has ever existed has buried children who did not make it. Children who were taken by disease, or by predators, or by accidents, or by the simple cruel mathematics of a world that did not care whether they lived or died." The room was very still. "And so we learned something," she said. "Over thousands and thousands of years, we learned that the groups who survived were not the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest. They were the ones who protected every child, not just their own children, but every child they could reach, because on a death world, a child who is not yours is still a child, and a child who dies is still a loss that makes the whole group weaker." She leaned forward, and her dark brown eyes locked onto Reshra's golden ones. "It is not policy," she said, "and it is not training, and it is not something we decided to do because a regulation told us to. It is in our bones, Reshra. It is in the deepest part of what makes us human, the part that was built by 10,000 generations of parents who buried their children and swore that the next generation would bury fewer." Reshra felt her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with breathing. "When I look at your daughter," Okafor said, "I do not see an alien cub. I do not see a Tohari child. I see a kid. And every single instinct I have tells me to keep that kid safe, and keep that kid happy, and keep that kid alive. And those instincts do not ask me what species she is first." She sat back. "You asked me why I sent 3 people for spilled water," she said, "and the answer is this: because one day it will not be water. One day it will be a fire, or a breach, or a system failure, or something none of us have imagined yet. And on that day, I want my team to already know your daughter's name, and her favorite cup, and where she likes to sit, and how fast she can move. I want them to reach her before she even knows she is in danger, because that is the only way I know how to love a child, and it is the only way my species has ever known." Reshra was quiet for a very long time. The drawings on the walls seemed brighter than before, and the little gifts on the shelf seemed heavier with meaning, and the room felt like a place where something sacred lived, even though no one had ever called it a temple. "On Tohar," Reshra said finally, and her voice was thick, "we teach our cubs to be strong by letting them struggle. We believe that comfort makes them weak, and that a cub who solves her own problems will grow into an adult who can survive anything." Okafor nodded slowly. "On Earth," she said, "we believe that children who are loved fiercely become the adults who love fiercely. And strength does not come from being alone. It comes from knowing that someone will always come for you." Reshra closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were wet. "Would you," she said, and she had to stop and start again, "would your people watch over Nyla officially as her safety guardians?" Okafor's expression softened in a way that made her whole face look different, warmer, younger, like the soldier had stepped aside and the person underneath had come forward. "Reshra," she said gently, "we have been watching over her since the day she boarded this ship." Reshra could not speak. She reached across the space between them and placed her paw over Okafor's hand, pressing down with gentle, firm pressure. And Okafor did not pull away, because she had read enough about Tohari culture to know what this gesture meant. It was the deepest expression of trust that a Tohari could offer to another being. It meant, "I place my child's life in your hands, and I do not need to be afraid." Okafor turned her hand over and held Reshra's paw. And they sat like that for a while, in the quiet room, surrounded by the drawings of children from 100 different worlds, and neither of them needed to say anything more. 3 months passed aboard the GCS Harmony's cradle, and the ship continued on its long, slow journey through the dark between stars. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed, because the hull was the same, and the engines were the same, and the stars outside the observation windows were the same cold, distant points of light they had always been. But inside the ship, everything was different. Tikrath submitted his completed behavioral report to the Galactic Cooperative Central Council on a quiet morning during the third week of the new cycle, and the report was 642 pages long, containing interviews, data, observations, and personal testimonials from members of every species aboard the vessel. He had titled it, On the Human Instinct, a Study in Irrational, Indiscriminate, and Unconditional Protection of the Young. He had spent 2 days on the conclusion alone, rewriting it again and again, because he wanted to get it right. The words exactly right, because he felt that what he had witnessed deserved precision and care, and the kind of attention that the humans themselves gave to everything they touched. The conclusion read as follows. In 11 months of continuous observation, I have documented over 400 individual incidents in which human crew members responded to perceived threats to children of non-human species aboard this vessel, and in every single case, the response was immediate and thorough, and delivered with a level of emotional investment that defies standard behavioral models for interspecies interaction. The children in question were not human, the families were not human, the cultural contexts were not human, and yet the humans responded as though every child on this ship carried their own blood and bore their own name. I have searched for an explanation rooted in strategy or politics or self-interest, and I have found none. And I have searched for an explanation rooted in regulation or training, and I have found that while the humans do have protocols and procedures, the depth of their response exceeds anything that policy alone could produce. What drives them is something older than policy and deeper than training. It is an instinct born on a world that killed their children for 100,000 years, until they became a species that would not allow it anymore. Not for their own young, and not for anyone else's. I recommend that human-style child safety protocols be adopted as the standard across all cooperative vessels and installations, not because they are efficient, not because they are logical, not because they can be justified by any cost-benefit analysis in any administrative framework, but because in 11 months of observation, not a single child aboard the Harmony's cradle was seriously harmed. The humans would not allow it. They would not allow it for their children. For ours. This is not a weakness to be studied, it is a strength to be emulated. The report was received by the Central Council, and it was read by every delegate, and it was discussed in closed session for 3 full days, and when the vote came, it was unanimous. The cooperative adopted the recommendation, and aboard the Harmony's cradle, the changes had already begun long before the council made it official. Tohari parents who had once watched from benches while their cubs played now walked up to human safety volunteers and asked them to stay, not because they did not trust their cubs to be strong, but because they had begun to understand that strength and safety were not enemies of each other. Reshra was the first to make the request official, and others followed. Dratha engineers, who had always worked alone in their fabrication bays, now sat beside human designers, and together they built things that neither species would have thought of alone. Play structures with surfaces calibrated for 6 different skin types, ramps and rails and soft barriers that met every child where they were and made every space a place where small bodies could move without fear. Vrosk led the first joint engineering team, and the ramp he had found outside his hatchling's door became the model for every transition point on the ship. Valesi administrators, who had always measured success in efficiency reports and resource allocation, now created a new role in the cooperative fleet, called the Guardian Corps, a dedicated child safety and welfare division modeled entirely on the human emergency response system, and they opened enrollment to every species, and the applications came in faster than they could process them. Pritha was appointed to lead the training program, and she began every orientation session with the same sentence. The goal is not to respond to emergencies, but to build a world where the emergency never reaches the. She had learned that sentence from Okafor. Catholian swim instructors began working alongside human safety monitors at the youth pools, and the combination of aquatic expertise and human vigilance created a system so thorough that Selkith told Tikrath it was the first time in his life he had watched children swim without a knot in his stomach. Even old Gavin, who had lived long enough to see many things change and most things stay the same, said that the ship felt different now, in a way he could not fully describe, except to say that it felt the way a home is supposed to feel, when the people inside it have decided to take care of each other. And in the middle of all of this, in the middle of the reports and the programs and the new protocols and the slow, quiet revolution that was reshaping life aboard the Harmony's cradle, there was a small silver-furred cub named Nyla, who did not know that any of it had happened because of her. Same low table on the family deck, 3 months after the day she knocked over her cup. And she was a little bigger now, and a little older, and she held her cup with both paws the way Dev had taught her. She was telling a new story to Kovin about a dream she had about a fish that could talk and also fly, and also it was blue this time instead of purple. And Kovin was listening with the same patient silence he always gave her. And everything was exactly the way it had always been. And then she knocked over her cup. The water spilled across the table and dripped onto the floor, and Nyla looked down at it and said, "Oops," the same way she had said it 3 months ago, with the same tone and the same expression and the same complete lack of concern. But this time, before the alert even triggered on the human monitoring system, a young Dratha volunteer named Scylla was already walking toward the table with a towel in her clawed hand and a warm smile on her face. Practiced in front of a mirror, because smiling did not come naturally to Dratha. But she had learned from watching Dev that a smile was the first thing you gave a child before you gave them anything else. And beside Scylla, a Valesi cadet named Orath was carrying a fresh cup of water at the exact temperature that Tohari cubs preferred, because he had memorized the preference files the way the humans memorized them. Because Pritha had told him that knowing a child's needs before they speak is the beginning of real guardianship. They reached Nilha at the same time, and Scylla knelt beside the table and began to clean the spill, while Orath set the new cup down gently and said in careful practice Tohari, "Here you go, little one." Nilha looked up at the Dratha and the Valesi with wide golden eyes, and she was confused for just a moment, because these were not the humans who usually appeared when she made a mess. But then she smiled, a big, bright-fanged 4-year-old smile. That lit up her whole spotted face, and she said, "Thank you." Across the family deck, leaning against a support pillar with his arms crossed, Dev watched the whole thing. He had seen the spill on his scanner, and he had started to move out of habit. But then he had seen Scylla and Orath already heading toward the table, and he had stopped, and something had bloomed in his chest that felt like every good thing he had ever done coming back to him at once. He nudged Okafor, who was standing beside him, reviewing a report on her datapad. She looked up. She saw the Dratha volunteer kneeling beside Nyla with a towel, and the Valesi cadet standing with a cup. And she saw Nyla's smile, and she saw the other alien crew members moving through the family deck with the same quiet watchfulness that her own team had carried alone for so long. Her throat tightened, and she pressed her lips together, and she blinked hard twice. Dev leaned toward her and whispered, "That?" Okafor nodded, and her voice was rough when she spoke. "Yeah," she said, "yeah, we did." High above them in the observation gallery, Tikrath stood where he always stood, with his datapad open and his stylus in his hand. And he watched the scene below, and he added one final entry to his report, a closing addendum that he had been trying to write for weeks, and that had finally come to him in this moment, as he watched a galaxy begin to learn what a small, stubborn species from a deadly world had known all along. He wrote, "When asked to define the human species in a single behavioral observation, I find I cannot improve upon the incident that began this study. A cub spilled her water, and the humans sent 3 trained responders and specialized equipment and a replacement cup, and the cub was never in danger. And that was precisely the point. The humans do not wait for danger. They build a world where it never reaches the child at all. Believe this is what they call love. I believe the galaxy would do well to learn it." He saved the file and closed the datapad, and looked down at the family deck one last time, where Nyla was holding her new cup with both paws and laughing at something Scylla had said, and Dev was watching, with his arms folded and his eyes bright. And Okafor was standing beside him, with the look of a woman who had just seen the future, and found it worthy of every single sleepless night she had ever spent worrying about children who were not hers. And the ship sailed on through the dark, carrying its precious cargo of 100 species and 1,000 children, and one simple idea that had started on a brutal little world at the edge of the galaxy, that every child matters, and every child deserves someone who will come for them before they even know they need help. The stars did not care, but the humans did, and now so did everyone else.